I thought I was selling my parents' old garage. I never expected it to reveal a secret they carried for decades. My name is Daniel Brooks, and after my parents passed away, I returned to the house where I grew up to handle everything they left behind. For most people, an empty house is just a place filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings. But for me, every corner held a memory. The kitchen where my mother made Sunday dinners. The backyard where my father taught me how to fix small things. The hallway where family photographs showed moments I wished I could experience one more time. Losing both of my parents within a short period changed the way I looked at everything. The house felt too quiet. The rooms felt too large. And the hardest part was knowing that the people who made that place feel like home were no longer there. My sister Emily had already taken some family photographs and personal items that meant the most to her. I had kept a few things too, but the reality was that I lived several states away and could not keep an entire property that I rarely visited. After weeks of thinking, I made the difficult decision to sell the house and the garage that my father had spent almost his entire life building and maintaining. The garage was always his favorite place. When I was younger, I would sit nearby while he worked on old furniture, repaired tools, or organized shelves that seemed to hold everything except empty space. My father, Robert Brooks, was a man who believed everything had value if you knew its story. He never liked throwing things away. He would always say, "You never know when something forgotten might become important again." At the time, I thought it was just another one of his sayings. I never imagined those words would come back to me years later. The day before the property was scheduled to be viewed by a potential buyer, I decided to clean out the garage one final time. I wanted to make sure there was nothing personal left behind. Dust covered the shelves, old boxes filled the corners, and my father's workbench still looked exactly the same as the last time I saw him standing there. As I moved a stack of wooden containers near the back wall, I noticed something unusual. Behind the shelves was a small door I had never seen before. I stopped and stared at it. I had spent countless hours in that garage as a child, but I had no memory of that door existing. My first thought was that it was probably just an old storage area my father had never mentioned, but something about it felt different. Maybe it was the way it had been hidden. Maybe it was the fact that my father, a man who explained everything, had never once talked about it. I slowly opened the door and found a narrow space filled with carefully organized boxes. Unlike the rest of the garage, everything inside was clean and protected. It was clear that my father had not forgotten about this place. He had intentionally kept it hidden. I stepped inside and noticed a small wooden box sitting on a shelf. There was a name written on top. My name, Daniel. I stood there completely still, looking at the box my parents had left behind without ever telling me it existed. At that moment, I realized I was not just cleaning out a garage anymore. I had found something my parents wanted someone to discover, and I had a feeling that whatever was inside that box would change the way I remembered them forever. For several minutes, I stood inside the hidden room behind my father's garage shelves, unable to decide whether I was curious or nervous. I had entered the garage expecting to sort through old tools and boxes, but instead, I had found a place my parents had carefully kept away from everyone. The small wooden box with my name written on top sat quietly on the shelf, waiting for me to discover it. I picked it up slowly and carried it back into the main garage area. I placed it on my father's old workbench, the same place where he had spent countless weekends repairing things around the house. Before opening it, I called my sister Emily. I knew she deserved to be there, whatever this was. Emily arrived less than an hour later, and the moment she saw the box, I could tell she felt the same strange feeling I had. It was not just a box. It was something our parents had intentionally left behind. We sat together at the workbench, surrounded by the familiar smell of the garage and the memories of our childhood. Then I opened it. Inside were several photographs, a small notebook, and a sealed envelope. The first photograph immediately caught my attention. It showed my parents when they were much younger, standing in front of the same garage. I had seen hundreds of pictures of them over the years, but I had never seen this one before. On the back of the photograph, my father had written a date and a short message. The beginning of something we never expected. I looked at Emily, wondering what it meant. She picked up the notebook and began flipping through the pages. It was not a diary about daily life. It was more like a collection of memories. My father had written about important moments, decisions, and people who had influenced his life. At first, I felt almost uncomfortable reading something so personal. It felt like I was stepping into a part of my parents' lives that existed before I was old enough to understand. But the more I read, the more I realized my father had not hidden this because he wanted to keep us away. He had hidden it because he wanted to preserve something important. The envelope was the last thing left. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. My hands became still as I opened it. The letter began with a sentence that made me pause. Daniel, if you are reading this, then you have found the place where your mother and I kept the memories we were not ready to share. I continued reading. My father explained that he and my mother had always believed children only saw one version of their parents. They saw the people who raised them, corrected them, and cared for them. But parents also had their own stories, struggles, and moments that shaped who they became. He wrote that the garage was not special because of the tools or the things stored inside. It was special because it was where he and my mother made decisions that changed their lives. I looked around the room again. Suddenly, the old shelves, the boxes, and the workbench felt different. They were no longer just objects. They were pieces of a story I had never known. Then I reached the part of the letter that made me stop reading. My father mentioned someone named James. He wrote that James was the person who helped our family during a difficult time many years ago. I searched my memory, but the name meant nothing to me. I had never heard my father mention him. The letter ended with one sentence that left me with more questions than answers. Daniel, before you decide what to do with this garage, I hope you discover why it was important to us. I folded the letter carefully and looked at Emily. We both knew this was not just about a hidden room anymore. There was a story behind it. A story our parents had carried for years. And the name James was the first clue to understanding it. After reading my father's letter, I could not stop thinking about the name James. It was strange how one person I had never heard of could suddenly become such an important part of my family's story. I looked through the notebook again, hoping to find more information, but my father had been careful with his words. He wrote about moments and feelings, but he rarely included details that explained everything. It was almost like he wanted me to discover the truth slowly, one piece at a time. Emily and I spent the rest of the evening sitting in the garage, going through the items inside the hidden room. We found old receipts, photographs, and documents that showed my parents had spent years building a life filled with more experiences than we ever realized. My mother had always been the person who kept family memories organized. She saved birthday cards, vacation photos, and small reminders of important days. But this collection was different. These were memories connected to a part of their lives that existed before we understood them. Emily picked up one photograph that showed our father standing beside another man near the garage. The man looked familiar, but neither of us could identify him. On the back of the photograph was the same name, James Carter. We decided we needed answers. The next morning, I called some of my father's old friends, hoping someone could tell me who James was. Most of the people I spoke with remembered my father. Well, but when I mentioned James, there was always a short pause before they responded. That reaction told me there was something more to this story. Finally, one of my father's longtime neighbors gave me information that changed everything. He said James Carter had been my father's closest friend many years ago. He told me that James was someone my father trusted completely, but he moved away before Emily and I were old enough to remember him. I asked why my father never talked about him. The neighbor simply said, "Your father believed some stories belonged to the people who lived them, not the people who heard about them." Those words sounded exactly like my father. He was always someone who respected other people's privacy. He never shared someone else's struggles just to make himself look good. The more I learned, the more I understood that his silence had a reason. Later that day, I found an old address written inside the notebook. It was not a home address. It was the address of a small community center several hours away. My father had written a note beside it, where the promise began. Emily and I looked at each other. We both knew we had reached the point where we could either stop searching or continue. Part of me wondered if I was going too far. Maybe some things were better left in the past. But another part of me felt that my father had left this path for a reason. He had not hidden these things because he wanted them forgotten. He had protected them because they mattered. The following weekend, Emily and I drove to the address from the notebook. The community center was older than I expected, but it was still active. Inside, we met a woman who recognized my father's name immediately. She told us that Robert Brooks had made a promise many years earlier, and that promise had changed several people's lives. I felt my heart race as I listened. For the first time, I realized the garage was not the secret. The garage was only where the secret had been waiting. The real story was about the choices my parents made and the people they helped without ever telling us. Before we left, the woman handed me a small folder that had been stored there for years. She said my father had asked her to give it to his children if they ever came looking. I held the folder in my hands and knew I was about to discover the truth my parents had carried for decades. When Emily and I left the community center with the folder my father had prepared years earlier, neither of us spoke for the first few minutes. We both understood that we were holding something important. It was not just a collection of papers. It was another piece of our parents' lives that they had chosen to protect until the right moment. We drove back home with the folder sitting carefully on the passenger seat, almost like another person was traveling with us. When we arrived, we returned to the garage where this entire journey had started. I placed the folder on my father's workbench and looked around the room. The same shelves, the same tools, and the same quiet space that had once seemed ordinary now felt completely different. Everything had a meaning I never noticed before. Emily and I opened the folder together. Inside were several documents, photographs, and a letter from James Carter. The letter explained that my father and James had known each other for many years, long before Emily and I were born. They met during a time when both of them were facing major changes in their lives. James wrote that my father was the kind of person who never asked what he could gain from helping someone. He only asked what he could do. As I read those words, I felt like I was discovering a person I had always known and yet never truly understood. My father had always been quiet. He rarely talked about his accomplishments or the people he helped. Growing up, I sometimes wished he would share more about his thoughts and feelings. Now I realized that his silence was not because he had nothing to say. It was because he believed some things were more meaningful when they were done without attention. The documents revealed that years ago, my parents had helped James during a difficult period in his life. They supported him when he needed guidance and gave him a place where he could rebuild his future. My father never considered it a major event. To him, it was simply something a person should do when they had the ability to help. But for James, that moment changed everything. One photograph inside the folder caught my attention. It showed my father, my mother, and James standing together in front of the garage. They were smiling, and behind them was the same hidden room I had discovered. On the back of the photograph, my mother had written a message. The best things we build are not always things we can see. I read the sentence several times. It explained so much about who my parents were. They were never focused on what they owned. They cared about what they gave to others. Emily became emotional while reading the documents. She admitted that she always thought our parents lived a simple life, but now she understood that their lives were filled with moments we never witnessed. They had stories, friendships, and choices that existed beyond our childhood memories. Before we finished looking through the folder, we found one final document. It was a map with a location marked near the back of the garage property. My father had written a note beside the mark, the place where everything started. I looked at Emily, and we both knew there was still another part of the story waiting for us. The hidden room had revealed the past, the folder had revealed the people, but now the map seemed to be leading us to the beginning of it all. The next morning, we returned to the garage with a new understanding. We were no longer searching because we wanted answers about a mystery. We were searching because we wanted to know the full story of the parents we thought we already knew. The next morning, Emily and I returned to the garage with the map from my parents' folder. For the first time since we started searching through their belongings, I did not feel like I was looking for a hidden secret. I felt like I was following a path my parents had carefully created for us. The location marked on the map was not far from the house. It was a small area behind the garage property that I had never paid much attention to because it was covered by trees and old storage items. My father had always been someone who liked keeping things organized, so I wondered why this place had remained untouched for so many years. As we walked toward the location, Emily looked around and smiled. She said she remembered our father spending time there when we were children. She always thought he was just fixing things or working on another project. Now we wondered if he had been protecting something much more meaningful. Behind a group of old trees, we found a small wooden storage structure. It was simple and aged, but it had clearly been maintained over the years. A small lock was attached to the door. I used the key that had been inside the hidden box, and the lock opened easily. Inside was not what I expected. There were no expensive items or valuable possessions. Instead, There were shelves filled with carefully organized memories. There were handwritten notes, old letters, photographs, and documents from years before Emily and I were born. It felt like walking into a room that belonged to another version of my parents, a version I had never met. I picked up one of the letters and saw James Carter's name again. This time, the letter was from my father to James. It explained how grateful he was for their friendship and how one decision they made together had changed the lives of several people. As I continued reading, I discovered that the story was not only about James. It was about a promise my parents made when they were younger. Years ago, they had met a family who was going through a difficult transition. My parents decided to help them quietly, without telling anyone. They provided support, guidance, and encouragement during a time when those people needed it most. My father wrote that he never wanted his children to know because he did not want us to grow up thinking kindness was something that should be rewarded or recognized. He wanted us to understand that helping others was simply part of being a good person. Emily looked at me and said something that stayed with me. She said, "I spent my whole life knowing Dad as our father, but I never knew him as the person he was before us." I understood exactly what she meant. We often forget that our parents had entire lives before they became parents. They had dreams, friendships, challenges, and moments that shaped who they became. The final item inside the storage room was a notebook belonging to my mother. Unlike my father's journal, her writing focused on the people they had helped and the lessons she learned from those experiences. She wrote that the greatest memories in life were not always the ones captured in photographs. Sometimes they were the moments when someone needed help and another person chose to be there. Reading her words made me realize something important. My parents had never been trying to leave behind a mystery. They were trying to leave behind a message. Before we left the storage room, I noticed one final envelope placed beneath the notebook. It had both my name and Emily's name written on it. This time, we opened it together. Inside was a letter from both of our parents. The first sentence immediately made us stop. "Our children, if you found this, then you are finally ready to understand why we kept these memories." I looked at Emily, and we both knew the next few pages would reveal the most important part of our parents' story. When Emily and I opened the letter from our parents, we sat quietly inside the small storage room behind the garage. For the first time since we started uncovering these memories, I felt like I was hearing my parents' voices again. The handwriting was familiar. The words felt like something my mother and father would have said if they were sitting right beside us. The letter began by explaining why they chose to keep these memories hidden. They wrote that they never wanted their children to feel responsible for carrying the weight of their past. They wanted us to grow up focused on our own lives, our own dreams, and our own families. They believed that some lessons were more powerful when discovered at the right moment. My father wrote that he hoped one day we would understand that the value of a person's life was not measured by what they owned, but by the difference they made in the lives of others. As I continued reading, I learned more about the promise my parents had made years earlier. It started with James Carter, but it became something much larger than one friendship. James had been going through a difficult transition after losing his job and struggling to rebuild his future. My father noticed that James did not need someone to feel sorry for him. He needed someone to believe in him. So my parents offered their support. They helped him find opportunities, encouraged him when he doubted himself, and reminded him that one difficult chapter did not define an entire life. What surprised me most was that my parents never considered it a major sacrifice. To them, it was simply the right thing to do. Emily looked at me and said she remembered our father always telling us that people should never measure their kindness by whether anyone notices. At the time, we thought it was just another life lesson from him. Now, sitting in that hidden room, we realized those words came from his own experiences. The letter continued with something that made both of us emotional. My parents explained that the garage was not just a place where my father repaired tools or stored old belongings. It was where they planned, talked, and made decisions about the kind of people they wanted to become. Every shelf, every box, and every forgotten item represented a memory connected to their journey. My mother wrote that she hoped we would not look at the garage as an old building after they were gone. She hoped we would see it as a reminder that a meaningful life was built through small choices made every day. After finishing the letter, Emily and I walked around the room again. We looked at the photographs differently. Before, we saw pictures of strangers from our parents' past. Now, we saw moments that showed their character. We saw two people who quietly cared for others without expecting anything in return. Before leaving, we found one final notebook underneath the letters. It belonged to my father, but unlike the earlier journal, this one contained plans for the future. I opened the first page and noticed a sentence written at the top. For Daniel and Emily, when you are ready. My hands became still as I turned the page. Inside were notes about our family history, memories from our childhood, and messages my father wanted us to know. But there was one section, marked with a date several years after the events involving James. I looked at Emily, and we both realized there was still another chapter waiting. Our parents had not only left behind memories of the past, they had left behind a final message about the future. And now we were about to discover why they believed the garage should never simply become another forgotten place. The notebook my father left behind became the most important thing I had ever found inside that garage. Emily and I brought it back to the house and spent the entire evening reading through the pages together. Unlike the other documents we discovered, this notebook was not about one specific event or one person. It was about the small moments that shaped our family. My father wrote about the lessons he learned from his own parents, the mistakes he made when he was younger, and the hopes he had for Emily and me. As I turned each page, I realized how little I truly knew about the man who raised me. I knew him as my father. I knew the person who taught me how to work hard, keep my promises, and treat people with respect. But I never knew the younger man who made difficult choices, built friendships, and created a life before I became part of it. One section of the notebook caught my attention. My father had written about the day he met James Carter. He explained that James was not just a friend. He was someone who reminded him that everyone deserves a second chance and someone willing to believe in them. My father wrote that people often notice the final results of someone's success, but they rarely see the people who helped them during the difficult moments. That was when I understood why my father never talked about what he had done. He did not want recognition. He wanted the people he helped to have the freedom to move forward without feeling like they owed him anything. Emily and I continued reading, and we discovered more about our mother's role in everything. She was not just supporting my father's decisions. She was an important part of them. My mother kept records, wrote letters, and remembered every person who crossed their path. She believed that kindness was something a family could pass down from one generation to the next. There was a page where she wrote a message directly to us. She said that children often believe their parents have all the answers, but parents are simply people who learn, grow, and try their best along the way. Reading those words made me think about all the times I misunderstood my parents. There were moments when I thought they were too quiet or too traditional. I thought they did not understand the world I lived in. But now I realized they had experienced things I never knew about. They carried lessons that came from years of helping others, facing challenges, and choosing compassion. Near the end of the notebook, my father wrote about the garage itself. He explained that he wanted it to remain a place where memories could continue. He wrote that objects were not valuable because of their price. They were valuable because of the stories connected to them. The old workbench, the shelves, and even the smallest items inside the garage represented moments that built our family. I closed the notebook and looked at Emily. For the first time since our parents passed away, the house did not feel empty. It felt like they had left pieces of themselves behind for us to discover. Before we finished for the night, I noticed one final page folded carefully at the back of the notebook. It contained a short message from my father with a date written several years before he passed away. The message was simple, but it immediately caught my attention. He wrote that there was one more thing inside the garage that he hoped we would find someday. Emily and I looked at each other, knowing that our journey was not finished. We thought we had uncovered the biggest secrets our parents kept, but my father had left one final discovery waiting for us. The next morning, Emily and I returned to the garage with a different feeling than before. When we first discovered the hidden room, we were searching for answers because we wanted to understand the secret our parents had kept from us. But now, after reading their letters and learning about their lives, we were no longer searching for a mystery. We were searching for one final piece of a story that had always been part of our family. The note from my father mentioned one more thing inside the garage. He did not explain what it was. He only wrote that we would know when we found it. We started looking carefully through the space, not wanting to overlook anything. Every shelf, every box, and every corner seemed to hold another memory. I found myself paying attention to details I had ignored my entire life. The small marks on the workbench where my father repaired things. The old calendar on the wall that still showed a month from years earlier. The handwritten labels on boxes that showed my mother's careful organization. After searching for nearly an hour, Emily noticed something unusual behind my father's old workbench. There was a small wooden panel that looked different from the rest of the wall. We moved the workbench slightly and discovered another hidden compartment. Inside was a simple envelope and a small collection of photographs. Unlike everything else we had found, this envelope was not old or forgotten. It had been placed there carefully, almost like my father knew exactly when we would find it. The envelope had both of our names written on it, Daniel and Emily. We sat together on the garage floor and opened it. Inside was a letter from both of our parents. It was not long, but every sentence carried meaning. They wrote that they hoped we found this only when we were ready. They explained that life often makes people focus on what they lose instead of what they still have. They wanted us to remember that even after someone is gone, the love and lessons they leave behind continue through the people they touched. My father wrote about the garage one last time. He said that he knew there would come a day when we would have to decide what to do with the house and the property. He did not want us to feel obligated to keep everything. He did not want memories to become a burden. Instead, he wanted us to make a choice based on understanding, not sadness. My mother added that the most important thing they hoped to leave behind was not a house, a garage, or any possession. It was the example they tried to set. She wrote that a family's greatest inheritance was not something stored in a bank account or hidden away in a room. It was the kindness, patience, and love passed from one person to another. As I read those words, I thought about how different my parents seemed now. Before this journey, I remembered them mainly through the role they played in my life. They were my parents. They were the people who raised me. But now I saw them as complete individuals with their own dreams, challenges, friendships, and values. Emily and I looked through the photographs inside the envelope. They showed moments we had never seen before. My parents helping neighbors, spending time with friends, and sharing simple moments that showed who they really were. There was nothing extraordinary about the pictures, yet they meant more than anything valuable we could have found. Before leaving the garage that day, I stood beside my father's old workbench one more time. The place that once felt like an unfinished responsibility now felt like a gift. I finally understood what my parents had been trying to show us. They were not leaving behind a secret. They were leaving behind a reminder of the kind of life they believed was worth living. But there was still one decision waiting for us. We had to decide what would happen to the garage that had changed the way we saw our family forever. For the first time since my parents passed away, I no longer looked at the garage as a place that needed to be cleared out. It was no longer just an old building filled with forgotten belongings. It had become a place where I discovered the story of two people I thought I already knew. A place where I learned that my parents' lives were much bigger than the memories I carried from childhood. After reading their final letter, Emily and I spent several days thinking about what we wanted to do with the garage. At first, selling it seemed like the easiest choice. It was practical. It was simple. It was what I originally planned. But after everything we discovered, walking away from it no longer felt right. We were not keeping the garage because we were unable to let go. We were keeping it because we finally understood its meaning. A few weeks later, Emily and I decided to clean the space and restore it in a way that honored our parents. We did not turn it into a museum or a place frozen in the past. Instead, we created a place where family and friends could gather, share memories, and continue the values our parents believed in. We kept my father's old workbench exactly where it had always been. We organized my mother's photographs and letters into albums so future generations could understand where our family came from. We even created a small area where people could write down their own memories and stories. Something unexpected happened after we opened the garage to our family and close friends. People began sharing stories about my parents that Emily and I had never heard before. Neighbors talked about moments when my father quietly helped them. Friends shared memories of my mother's kindness and the way she always made people feel welcome. I realized then that the hidden room was never the only place where my parents' story existed. Their story lived in the people whose lives they had touched. One afternoon, James Carter visited the garage for the first time in many years. Standing there with him, I finally understood why my father had valued their friendship so deeply. James looked around the room and smiled. He said that Robert always believed the most important things in life were the things people could not measure. Not money, Not possessions, but trust, kindness, and the memories created with others. Hearing those words brought everything together for me. My father had spent his life building something that could not be seen from the outside. The garage was only a symbol of that. The real legacy was the impact he and my mother left behind. Before this experience, I thought losing my parents meant losing a part of my family's story. I thought their memories would slowly become smaller with time. But I learned something completely different. The people we love continue through the lessons they leave behind and the kindness they share with others. Months later, when I finally finished the paperwork for the property, I no longer felt like I was closing a chapter. I felt like I was carrying one forward. The garage remained standing, not because it was an expensive building or because it held valuable objects. It remained because it represented everything my parents believed about family and life. Looking back, I realized I returned home expecting to sort through old things and move on. Instead, I found a connection to my parents that I never knew I needed. I found their voices in their letters, their hearts in their choices, and their love in every small detail they left behind. The greatest discovery was not hidden behind a wall or inside a box. It was the understanding that my parents had been teaching me their most important lessons all along. I just needed time to truly see them.